You're listening to Inside Eyes, and I'm your host, Laura Mae Northrup. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for joining me. I am your host, Laura Mae Northrup. We are on episode 11 of season 2. If you are starting this series for the first time, please note that the series is roughly designed to be listened to as a sequential series, as well as individual episodes. At times, there are topics covered in one episode and then expanded on in another. Essentially, a lot can be gathered by listening to the entire series in order. I encourage you to start with the first episode in this season, entitled Welcome Magic. And before I go on, I want to share that I wrote and published a book. My book is called Radical Healership: How to Build a Values-Driven Healing Practice in a Profit-Driven World. Part memoir and part politicized self-help. In a nutshell, this is basically a self-help book for the helpers. It's for healing practitioners of all kinds, including therapists, psychedelic guides, breath workers, etc. Truly, any type of healing practitioner. And it tackles spiritual, psychological, and political issues around what it means for us to survive in capitalism and offer healing work with integrity. Even people who are not healing practitioners, but simply self-employed, have reached out to let me know that it's supported them in transforming how they work. I spent the lockdown portion of the COVID-19 pandemic writing this thing, and seriously, I poured my heart, soul, and tears into this book. It is already sold out of its first printing, and people seem to find it super helpful. So, if you like what you hear on my show, the same level of heart and intention is waiting for you in that book. And if you get the audiobook, it's read by yours truly. You can find it anywhere books are sold, including ordering through an independent bookseller. If you are considering becoming a healing practitioner, or you already are one, but you want to rethink how you walk your path, check it out. Again, it's called Radical Healership: How to Build a Values-Driven Healing Practice in a Profit-Driven World. And please note, although at the time of this recording, I am a licensed psychotherapist in the state of California in the United States, this podcast is not therapy, it is not a substitute for therapy, and it is not advice attuned to your specific needs. So please seek out advice from a trained, competent practitioner about your specific situation to keep you as safe as possible before embarking on any healing with psychedelics or entheogens. I offer these insights in the spirit of harm reduction and education. And remember that there is sensitive content in these episodes that is not suitable for children. All right, on to today's topic. I titled this episode Guides and Facilitators, which is intentionally a bit vague. This is an episode about choosing a guide, facilitator, or psychedelic therapist, but in a sense, it is also about being a facilitator. So I will largely speak in a frame focused on choosing a guide for people who are seeking healing in an expanded state of consciousness. But guides or guides-to-be who are listening, this one is for you too. And you will find that the next episode is more explicitly about becoming or being a guide, so stay tuned for that as well. So let's get started. For healing to be powerful, there is always a risk. We do not transform while we are guarded or checked out. A certain level of presence and vulnerability is required for transformation to take place. And that vulnerability is where a lot of the risk originates. If you work with a facilitator present while you are in an expanded state, they are tasked with honoring your vulnerability and working to keep you safe in the environment and in the relationship with them. In interviews, I often get the question, how should one choose a guide? And this question is asked because while there are many exceptional facilitators out there, to be quite frank, there are also many facilitators and guides who end up enacting harmful dynamics and behaviors in their work. Holding this kind of space for healing trauma requires incredible skill, and many people do not receive adequate training and ongoing mentorship, or underestimate the value of being well-trained. And for some, even with extensive training, as well as mentors and peer oversight, they do not do the personal work required to be a practitioner who can stay in integrity with a vulnerable person who is seeking healing. Regarding issues related to training, there are many factors influencing how and why facilitators do and don't receive training. And as a person seeking their services, I think it is important for you to understand some of what is happening, so you can make choices that honor the interconnected systems of life involved here, including yourself. First, let's talk about criminalization, which introduces some particular difficulty around adequate training, because so many of the entheogens and psychedelics used for healing are largely illegal around the world. Facilitators-to-be are often only aware of in-depth training opportunities through word of mouth. If a practitioner does not know of, and therefore does not receive adequate training, this means that, plainly speaking, they don't have enough training. It also means that once they are practicing, without enough training, They may also not be aware of, informed by, or involved in much community. Having a community of colleagues is an important component in how facilitators continue to educate themselves. Being isolated as a facilitator can lead to a dearth of knowledge and support, which has a big impact on the people they serve. There are above-ground legal training programs, but they often do not have a component of working directly with whatever medicine the training is focused on, or they require the student to fly to another country where it is legal to experience that medicine. This makes the cost of the training exorbitantly expensive and prohibitive for most people. Criminalization also creates guide communities that are complex to enter. So what happens when someone in those communities is a guide that acts out of integrity? Often practitioners do not report other facilitators or do not make it publicly known when they are concerned about a particular guide for fear of their colleague being prosecuted and incarcerated. And if the guide in question has substantial social power, speaking out about concerns could result in the reporting practitioner losing access to a community that was difficult to gain access to in the first place and is necessary for one's ability to work. All of this, unfortunately, results in either practitioners not having enough community oversight or communities that struggle to take action in response to harm. In my experience, another aspect of inadequately trained providers stems from misconceptions about this work. When people receive guided work, they often perceive the facilitator is doing something that looks easy or easy enough for them to replicate. This is further obfuscated by the fact that there are such a variety of ways to use different psychedelics and entheogens. If you can take MDMA at a music event and be fine, how much training does one really need to be an MDMA guide? If it is possible to take mushrooms alone and be fine, how much training does one need to be a mushroom facilitator? I cannot emphasize enough the number of people I've spoken with who do not believe they need much training, who think they can do a highly specialized job simply based on their natural gifts or their perception that facilitators are not doing much. Even if you are gifted, you need training and mentorship to hone those gifts. A common sentiment I have heard many times over is something along the lines of, I don't want to go to grad school because it takes too long, or I don't want to take XYZ training because it takes too long or it is too expensive. Yes, training, school, or apprenticeship costs money. And yes, each of those takes a long time. And yes, it is still very required. When facilitators-to-be are resistant to the idea of receiving training, oversight, or becoming an apprentice, this is a big red flag. It is crucial for any type of professionalized care work that your provider has access to training and peer oversight or consultation. The reason for this in your case is that if something becomes a struggle in their work with you, they need other minds and hearts to consult about ensuring that they can stay in integrity with you and provide you a safe enough healing environment. And finally, I want to talk a bit about how settler colonial thinking and capitalism impacts this profession, because this relates to training and much more. In the US, we have so thoroughly degraded the value of spirituality, apprenticeship, and subtle work. And more specifically, the white supremacist project of European colonization actively devalues these things within Indigenous contexts. Here in the US, that is a documented fact. Indigenous peoples have faced persecution for maintaining their spiritual practices, cultural customs, and languages, while being subjected to the adoption of Christian religion, English language, and Eurocentric norms, a process they resisted historically and continue to resist today. And I would be remiss not to mention, it is documented that significant instances of this oppression occurred via state-sanctioned Indian boarding schools, schools that utilized rampant sexual abuse of Indigenous children as a means to intentionally commit cultural genocide. As discussed in this series, this is a type of violence that so thoroughly damages relationship to a spiritual self and life. I think with regard to entheogenic healing in the US, what I am describing results in a complicated dynamic of non-Indigenous people both fetishizing and idealizing Indigenous wisdom that specifically white European-descended people are largely not connected to within our own lineages, while simultaneously degrading that wisdom by treating it as an unnecessary level of training or something that a European-descended person can do simply by some natural skill afforded to us through our fabricated superiority. Much of the very profound wisdom that exists about using entheogens and psychedelics in spiritual and healing contexts is quite literally from Indigenous peoples who have carried the knowledge and traditions for generations, and resisted erasure of these healing technologies, despite their attempted destruction by European colonizing forces. Scientists, academics, and other researchers who are running research labs, designing methodologies for new and novel treatments, and teaching their way of working, behind the scenes, I can tell you that most of those people have worked with an Indigenous provider or worked with someone who was trained by an Indigenous provider. But many do not acknowledge that in professional contexts. This is often in part an act of white supremacy, cultural appropriation, and colonization, and in part due to criminalization and fear of being written off as overly spiritual or promoting non-evidence-based practices. So in essence, also white supremacy and colonization. While I can respect the fear of being written off by colleagues, participating in the erasure of the truth in this manner is participation in cultural genocide toward Indigenous peoples. Transforming the harrowing conditions we exist within requires us to be brave, to acknowledge fear, and then find the courage to speak the truth regardless of it. If you are not an Indigenous person and you choose to work with an Indigenous provider, or you work with someone who was trained by Indigenous people and is practicing within an Indigenous lineage, regardless of if they themselves are Indigenous, there is a high risk of engaging in spiritual extractivism, essentially paying for the experience with the guide, finding your own healing and awakening your consciousness, but then lacking solidarity with the struggle for sovereignty of the tribe or sovereign nation that healer is a part of, or more broadly lacking solidarity with the liberation of all Indigenous people. Engaging in this kind of behavior extends from not understanding that our struggles are connected, that sexual violence is a politicized violence, and the conditions that allow it to happen are the same conditions that allow the horrendous oppression of Indigenous people. When we embrace a neoliberal capitalist mindset, this seems fine. You paid for the service, you don't need to do anything else. But when we reject a capitalist mindset and see our inherent interconnectedness, something else happens. You enter into a real relationship. In countries where certain entheogens are legal, many retreat centers serving the global community, with Indigenous providers running the ceremonial portions, are owned by European-descended foreigners, with substandard working conditions and unfair compensation to locals. Oftentimes, those retreat centers are contributing to Indigenous healers leaving their communities to primarily heal foreigners, with the original community bearing the loss of the practitioner. And while some might make the argument that this is producing employment opportunities for impoverished communities, consuming plant medicines at rates that threaten their existence and giving highly oppressed people a barely consensual option for work is just capitalism. It isn't liberatory and it isn't right. To enter into one of these spaces as an outsider and a member of a colonizing political force presents an opportunity for increased understanding, relationship, and solidarity. Some things you can do. 1. If you travel to a retreat center to work with an Indigenous provider, check to make sure it is not owned by a foreigner. If possible, do research about the working conditions for employees. This is often more obvious to people who have been to the center, and you can ask to speak to former participants to gather more information about the entire experience. 2. If you travel to one of these places, or even if you don't, donate to an organization that is Indigenous-led and focuses on the needs that Indigenous people are dictating for themselves. And the reason I specifically say dictating for themselves is because there are many organizations that provide services which are dictated by people who are not a part of the population they serve. Support an organization that honors Indigenous people's right to determine their own needs and trajectory. 3. When it comes to entheogens, educate yourself on the conditions surrounding these medicines. People are already expressing concern about deforestation and the future extinction of the ayahuasca vine. It is possible to buy ayahuasca made from farmed vine, and if you are drinking this medicine, you can ask your provider about the sustainability of the ayahuasca they serve. The Sonoran desert toad, which is a natural source of 5-MeO-DMT, often referred to simply as bufo, is a threatened species, and the process of extracting the 5-MeO-DMT from the toad is physically invasive. There is also a perfectly suitable alternative, which is synthetic 5-MeO-DMT. And if you feel the synthetic isn't good enough for you, I invite you to seriously check yourself on entitlement here. Yes, it is not the same experience to use a synthetic substance, but you are valuing your own healing over the existence of an entire species. That is not liberation, and it is not an advisable way to pursue healing. 4. Regarding the sustainability of certain entheogens, come to the medicine when you are ready, having done ample prep work, and do your integration work. Sometimes people get into a cycle of endlessly consuming medicine and not making it very far in their healing. In my opinion, this is often from a lack of work outside of your journeys, and it is a misuse of sacred medicines. In the case of ayahuasca vines, they need to grow for at least 5 years to be able to support you to heal. The root of the iboga plant is not ready to be made into medicine for upward of 7 to 10 years. You can meet that level of effort in your own preparation and approach to these experiences. Talking about how many journeys you have done and comparing yourself to other people in a battle to see who has done it the most is disrespectful to your own healing, to the plants, and to the medicine keepers. While expanded states of consciousness can be brutal trials, you are not in a Mountain Dew commercial. This isn't about racking up intense experiences to show off. It is about healing and honoring every person, plant, and creature that makes this healing possible. 5. If you work with a non-Indigenous provider who is trained in an Indigenous lineage, ask them about their relationship with their teachers and the lineage. 6. And circling back to training in general, a simple question you can ask a facilitator you are considering working with is, can you tell me about your training and/or the lineage you work in? And the last thing I will say on this is that while I encourage you to ask your provider questions about their work and the experience you will have with them, it may also be the case that you work with a facilitator that does not speak the same language as you or share the same culture. This is sometimes how it goes when flying to a different country for treatment or when a facilitator is flown into your country. Under those circumstances, you may be navigating complex cultural dynamics that are unknown to you, and there may be a language barrier. Often when that occurs, there will be a point person who helps to translate and steward you through the cultural dynamics. Some of what I'm going to suggest in this episode will need a little translation in a context like that as well. For example, questioning an Indigenous elder about how they practice or what their training was is not always respectful. Emphasizing the need to know exactly how a journey will be structured is not necessarily a part of how all traditions work. Many forms of spiritual expanded state work include a process of surrendering and opening up to mystery, in such a way that questioning what may happen in the ceremony would not even translate. Some practitioners will not hold your hand through suffering because they see that as something you must find your own way through, or they attend to those moments in ways that might not be culturally familiar to you, like singing a song to spirits or blowing smoke over your body. In some cultural traditions, the facilitator is protecting their knowledge and would never explain it in depth to a stranger working with them for a single night. Or there may be ways the facilitator speaks about what is happening in the ceremony space and in your health that is grounded in such a different cosmology to yours that you don't understand at all what they are saying to you, even if it is spoken in your language. There may be cultural differences around personal space or physical contact. However, any highly skilled healing practitioner, no matter the tradition, understands the importance of safety, and anyone who is their point person to communicate with you should understand this as well. In these contexts, you can still work to gather information about the experience and sort out if it is right for you, and everything I point out as major areas to consider when vetting a facilitator still hold. But you may need to be working with the point person for some of this, and there may be elements about spirituality or frame that won't translate. This is an important thing to consider in your healing. For some, having a language barrier or large cultural difference is not a concern, and for others, it ignites a high level of fear to feel like you cannot easily communicate or be understood. There is no right way to be, but I encourage you to really consider what you need and move forward from that place. So, to summarize, a part of selecting a guide is maneuvering through a complex landscape that includes criminalization, colonization, systemic oppression, and unexamined issues around power. I'm offering suggestions here, and while I wish I could offer you some path forward that neatly navigates all that I have described, I simply cannot. I am also in this with you, learning alongside you as I go, and I don't have all the answers. As practitioners or as people seeking healing, we must continue our efforts to find integrity amidst these different forces, even when it is confusing, humbling, and requires immense effort, for our personal and collective healing is interconnected within all of these realms. Now I'm going to cover a few aspects of what constitutes a strong guide for your work. Please know that even very good guides, who come highly recommended, can act in harmful ways. I hear about this fairly regularly, and it is important to remember that loads of experience is not always equal to safety and skill. Choosing a guide is something you need to do with extreme care, caution, and patience. If you only have access to one referral, that is not a reason to trust that person. Do not embark on this process with someone unless you have really done the work to find a true place of consent within yourself to move forward. You deserve to work with a very good practitioner. For a series of complex psychological reasons, one of the places that guides can get out of integrity is working with survivors of sexual violence, and specifically survivors of childhood sexual abuse. So, I say this with an immense level of care for you. Wait until you find a good fit. If this is the most important work you will ever do, treat it with that level of reverence. You need to find someone who does their own healing work, is extremely well-trained, and frankly, operates from a pure heart. And that doesn't mean someone with no shadow or no faults, but it does mean someone who is willing to know their flaws, willing to encounter their shadow, willing to understand their capacity to harm you. Doing this work asks a lot of the facilitator. It is immensely impactful to bear witness to stories of and hold space for people surviving violence. And the work is largely illegal. People who sign up to do this are often doing it from a place of confusion, wanting to be helpful, wanting to be liked, wanting to be revered. And that is not wrong. It is just some of the reality of the path of healership. And side note, if you're curious to hear more of my thoughts on this, I talk about it at length in my book, Radical Healership, in chapter 3, entitled The Shadow Why. At some point, most practitioners have to face all of that, have to face their limited capacity and limited power, have to face what it actually means to witness this much pain, and they have to face how that will change their lives, the level of personal work they will need to do, the level of personal strength and courage they will need to develop, the willingness to have your heart break and still choose love and compassion. This is not simple work, and walking the path with integrity can be quite brutal. So, you are looking for someone who can do all that and still chooses to do this work. For practitioners who do not do that work, who resist their own growth and examining their own shadow, they run the risk of acting out their unconscious material on the people they work with. Much like I talked about in the episode on feelings, when I spoke of how, as a survivor, you may have ways that you act out your unconscious feelings in order to take care of yourself, and how, in extreme cases, that can be abusive. Psychedelic providers are people, just like you. And to do this work safely, they need to have done substantial healing of their own and be dedicated to doing more healing work as needed. There are a variety of red flags that indicate someone is not doing their healing work, but to some degree, this is something you cannot always track about a person. This is part of why trusting your intuition and getting a strong referral is helpful. In terms of the red flags, many of those will be evident in this next section, as I explain a series of things to look out for. But before I get into those, I want to say a little bit more about the broad variety of healing containers within the field of psychedelic and plant medicine. There are a lot of types of facilitators or guides. Some sit with you, they allow ample silence and do little talking. They provide a warm presence. Some talk with you extensively before, during, and after the journey, and may even do psychological work with you. Internal family systems and different somatic modalities are very popular among facilitators. Some will provide you with psychotherapy ongoingly, and you may occasionally do guided medicine work as a part of the therapy. Some do hands-on work and may actually be quite interactive with your body. Others will not touch you at all. Some will see you one-on-one, and some will work with you in a group so large that you mostly interact with their assistants. Some will have one or more intake sessions giving you individualized care, and some will do the work to rule out risks such as medical contraindications, but largely they do not know what you are working on and are simply holding space for you. This tends to happen more in group settings. Some will sing and chant to you, some will play instruments, some will put on a pre-recorded playlist, and some will have you sit in silence. Some work is done indoors, maybe even in a hospital. Some work is done outside. You are allowed to wander in nature while in your process. This field is vast, and there are an infinite number of ways facilitators practice. Okay, up next, I'm going to go over a few topics that will be important for you in vetting a guide, regardless of who you see and how they work. In the realm of psychotherapy, we have a dynamic we strive to avoid called dual relationships. And what this means in a psychedelic healing context is avoiding having multiple strong ways of relating between the facilitator and the journeyer. This is important because there is an inherent power dynamic between the guide and the journeyer that cannot, in any way whatsoever be eliminated. Avoiding dual relationships is one way of managing the power dynamic. For example, someone who is your guide and your best friend's partner is a dual relationship. You know this person socially in a close way. This person may have some power over your life, separate from the guided work. They may have certain needs in the social relationship that impact the healing relationship. For instance, what happens if you do a journey where you start to realize you feel emotionally mistreated by your friend, who is also their partner? And what if some of what you experience, the guide is also experiencing in their relationship with your friend / their partner? And perhaps they are in denial and don't want to face it. How is that going to affect your journey session? Is the guide getting activated? Are they wanting you to be in denial about this too? Or are they, for the first time, starting to work on their feelings about being mistreated as a part of your process? And are they still present for you now that this has emerged for them? For people listening, you may think I'm being quite strict, and perhaps for someone who is able to navigate very complicated overlaps, this advice will not be relevant. However, I am speaking to survivors attempting to heal a wound that is relational in nature, extremely complex, and in itself is a boundary violation. So, if that is you, I offer this reminder. Even if other people you know are working in highly overlapped conditions, doing so often poses a higher risk for you as a survivor of sexual trauma. You are looking for a guide or facilitator, not a friend, not a mentor, not a parent, not a lover, not a business partner. You are seeking someone who does not in any way create a second type of relationship with you, someone who can see a line and never cross it. And we are talking about someone who does not ask you for advice about their life, does not share intimate details about their life, and maybe wouldn't even ask you for a restaurant recommendation. Sometimes people interpret the concept of strong boundaries and no dual relationship as simply being distant with each other. And some of the way I am describing working has a lot of stuff about it that can feel very akin to white cultured ways of relating, cold, overly boundaried, and not in community relationship. A guide can be very boundaried and still be humble, vulnerable, in authentic relationship to you, and manage light, distant overlaps. Like perhaps you very casually know some of the same people, or they have worked with other people in your community. Rather than creating distance, what you are actually doing with all these boundaries is cultivating a very specific kind of closeness. Boundaries do not need to result in being unkind or withdrawn. They just need to honor the work that is happening. It is very intimate to witness a journey and be witnessed while journeying. And due to the complications in healing from sexual violence, clear, unbroken boundaries are integral to sharing that kind of intimacy. And while psychedelics are boundary dissolving, that in no way means that the practitioner should allow the boundaries of the healing relationship to dissolve. I will add that some types of work happen in community. For example, sometimes a guide will run group psychedelic experiences, and you may find yourself chatting with others, building relationships with people who know the guide. You may have more casual conversation with the guide. If you are working with a facilitator that involves some community overlap, you still want to avoid connections that would constitute a dual relationship. If you have found yourself in tricky dynamics with other types of providers, authority figures, or in abusive relationships with peers, these are all signs that a very boundaried relationship may be helpful as your healing is happening. In which case, even in a community setting, you may be benefited by working to avoid all overlap while you heal some of these relational wounds. Part of what happens in the wake of experiencing sexual violence is that you can unconsciously enact old dynamics, and this happens a lot in healing relationships. For example, an unconscious dynamic that forms easily is one where the facilitator steps into the role of savior. Many practitioners want to be effective, and that can easily slip into wanting to be the one who fixes, saves, or performs the healing, rather than being the one who accompanies, supports, and creates space for you to save yourself, so to speak. And unsurprisingly, many survivors want someone who can save them. That could be a conscious or unconscious wish. And this is perfectly normal to wish that there was someone who could have protected you and someone who can take the pain away now. However, the very hard reality of surviving and transforming trauma is that no one is going to step in and save you from your healing process. No one is going to erase the past. And when a facilitator acts in any way as though they can save you, and you in any way start to believe that, even if it is unspoken and unconscious, you will be so disappointed in the end. In fact, you may be so disappointed that you feel harmed by it. Many people have this type of disappointment, even when that dynamic has not formed. They simply feel let down that a savior doesn't exist. But when some part of you has been led to believe that could be possible, the disappointment can almost feel like you have been lied to or are being traumatically abandoned. And then the dynamic can flip from innocent child being saved by an adult to innocent child being abandoned by an adult, which is another common dynamic that can be enacted when attempting to heal sexual abuse. When these intense emotions are formed, it takes a very skilled clinician to support awareness that this is traumatic material surfacing, rather than simply becoming angry at the survivor and punishing them, or ending the healing relationship, or doubling down to try and become the savior again because they cannot tolerate the feeling of someone being disappointed in them. And if perhaps the practitioner did engage in misleading you, it also takes a very skilled practitioner to own that and move from the place of enacting a fantasy of healing into embracing the reality of it. This brings us back to the importance of avoiding dual relationships. Sexual trauma is simply a type of wounding that involves a particularly high level of intense, unmetabolized emotions, many of which exist in the relational realm and are therefore enacted within relationships. This can be extremely difficult to work with, even when there is no social overlap. There need to be boundaries between the facilitator and the journeyer because the level of emotional intensity that arises needs a very safe space to be transformed. If that guide becomes disturbed by your anger at them not saving you, and they also have access to you socially, that is an arena where acting out can happen. If you become very angry that your practitioner cannot save you, and you have access to them socially, that is another avenue of potentially acting out your aggression. What happens when we minimize these social overlaps is the potential to bring everything back to the healing container and get very curious about what is happening, what needs to be known, what is trying to transform, allowing the dynamics to be symbolic of the past rather than actually enacting the past and creating new wounding. The more that the facilitator works in a psychological or engaging way, the more that social overlap is a concern. So if you engage in a community ceremony where you are largely silent and you do not talk with the facilitator at all, that produces a different risk level of relational enactment than if you do one-on-one work where the facilitator knows your entire history, talks with you in depth before, during, and after the journey, and also provides some level of the witnessing and interpretation I talked about in episode 3 on feelings. Survivors sometimes perceive this level of intentionality as a lack of care and fear working with someone who is so boundaried. You will need to slowly assess if this is indeed a lack of care or if it is a level of care that you might be unfamiliar with. If your guide doesn't respond to messages or changes things up at the last minute, or seems in any way like someone you cannot become extremely vulnerable with, I encourage you to think and feel about if this is the person to work with. However, when a guide refrains from talking about themselves, doesn't invite you into their inner circle, and does not pursue a friendship with you, this is not about them not liking you or not respecting you. It is about them creating a safe environment for you to do good healing work together. If you want to understand more about harm and healing relationships, you can listen to episode 16 of season 1 of the same podcast called Dynamics of Sexual Harm in Psychedelic and Entheogenic Spaces. Another aspect of boundaries is the level of self-disclosure the guide or therapist offers up. Someone who talks about themselves a lot, especially in a way that implies at all that they have figured it out or are superior to you in their healing, is a giant red flag. You are looking for someone who is humble, who knows their flaws, who can truly say, I don't know all the answers. I am simply doing what I think is right now. And you're looking for someone who lets you fill the space, someone who allows you to encounter yourself. And that type of space can only be held by someone who has done that very same work themselves. A guide or a therapist who doesn't talk about themselves is a good sign. There are exceptions to this, of course, but I encourage you to really explore in yourself how you actually feel about anything your guide or therapist has shared with you and sit with if that communicated care and strength or an unexamined shadow. Sometimes it can feel unnerving when a practitioner gives you all the space to fill, and that is okay to feel uncomfortable. Healing relationships are very different than social relationships. In a social relationship, when one person is more quiet, the other person may graciously fill the space or work to generate something that the two of you can discuss. In a healing space, we sit in the emptiness. We encounter the anxiety and discomfort to more deeply understand its meaning and purpose. We may patiently wait for something to organically emerge rather than generating conversation to run from the void. That is not to say that in the beginning of your work together, that whatever practitioner you are working with shouldn't help you to get acquainted with the process or perhaps give you some places to start. It is more to say that practitioners shouldn't jump to fill the space with their own stories or tell you what to do because of what they have done. With regard to psychological work, if your guide does not have psychology training, they should not be doing psychological work with you. I repeat that. If your guide does not have psychology training, they should not be doing psychological work with you. Maybe with someone who is not a sexual trauma survivor, I won't give my opinion on that. But for you, they need to have in-depth psychological training if they're working with you in this manner. And psychological training is not watching Instagram and TikTok videos from mental health influencers. It is being trained by people with years of experience and extensive knowledge, as well as being in ongoing community with those people to discuss clinical work and engage in peer-to-peer oversight. Working with sexual trauma is extremely complex, and you deserve to work with someone who understands that. I cannot emphasize this enough. I am very concerned about psychological interventions made by facilitators who lack psychological training, with little regard for how their position of power leads journeyers to experience those unskilled interventions. Some of you might be wondering what constitutes psychological work. Interventions that focus on interpreting someone's inner world, speaking to unconscious motivations and processes, and diagnosing psychological issues are all types of psychological work. For example, let's say that a child sexual abuse survivor has a troubled relationship with their older sibling, and during a prep session for a journey, reports that they have never trusted this sibling, highlighting that they always feel dropped and seem angrily dysregulated when they say this. And perhaps the facilitator can clearly see that there is a lot behind this statement and wonders to themselves if the survivor blames the sibling for the abuse because the sibling didn't protect them. It is okay for the facilitator to wonder about that in their own mind, regardless of their training. A psychological intervention might be to explore this through questions and statements made by the facilitator, such as, "It seems you have not felt protected by your sibling. Is there any part of you that wishes they could have protected you from the abuse?" This would only be appropriate to say if the facilitator is trained to work psychologically. If they are not working psychologically, they may say something like, "I hear that you don't trust your sibling and have a lot of emotion about it. What is your goal in bringing that to the journey we have scheduled?" That is simply being present with what the journeyer is saying and inviting them to think deeper about it. If the journeyer says, "I think I am blaming my sibling for not protecting me," and the facilitator supports the journeyer to stay with that thought and be with the feelings, that is not an overstep into psychological work. That is, again, being present and supporting the journeyer's presence. That statement about the sibling may seem innocuous, and you may wonder why it is important not to make it if it could be useful for the survivor to think about. What happens if the survivor isn't ready to confront that perhaps they do blame their sibling? And what happens if the survivor interprets the guide to be taking the side of their sibling, as though the question is more of an accusation? A simple interpretation requires a lot of skill to navigate the myriad of responses that it could elicit. Avoiding working psychologically can get tricky when the person seeking healing has a lot of relational trauma, because that relational injury can arise in the relationship with the provider, regardless of what the provider does. For example, the person in the scenario I just described may fear that the facilitator won't protect them enough in the journey. They may do the journey and then feel angry in an integration session about not being held well enough. In a sense, some of the original wound might constellate between the facilitator and the journeyer. For this reason, if you have a lot of relational wounding, and you often find that you feel a lot toward people who offer you care. That could be positive or negative emotions. It might make sense for you to seek out a guide who has the training and experience to meet you in that place. One more issue I want to address related to this is guides and facilitators making bold statements about sexual trauma. Things like telling a survivor they are gay or trans because of the sexual trauma they experienced, or telling a journeyer they were sexually abused by a specific family member based on something the guide is sensing, or suggesting that a survivor isn't feminine enough because of sexual abuse. No matter how much psychological training someone has or does not have, they should never tell you that your identity is a result of sexual violence, and they should never suggest that you were sexually abused as a child or suggest who they think committed that abuse. If you are uncertain and wondering about potential abuse, a psychologically trained provider can support your uncertainty and wondering, but that would be very careful support that does not include suggesting what happened or who the perpetrator was. And lastly, on psychological work, facilitators without appropriate training should never diagnose you. For example, if a survivor exhibits a lot of anxiety, accompanied by repetitive compulsive behaviors, and the facilitator suspects the journeyer may meet the criteria for a diagnosis of obsessive compulsive disorder, rather than telling this person they, quote, probably have OCD, a more appropriate statement would be a line of questioning. Have you ever seen a psychologist for your anxiety? I hear that you have a lot of repetitive compulsive behaviors. I would recommend getting an assessment to support you in receiving adequate treatment. I want to turn now to talking about touch. As I mentioned previously, psychedelics are boundary dissolving, and with some medicines, especially MDMA, people often feel more open to touch, conversation, and types of intimacy that they may not feel open to when sober. In some contexts, this is considered a catalyst for healing because people report being able to tolerate more challenging traumatic material and can be more open and loving toward themselves and others. However, this also presents the potential that the journeyer will agree to an experience in the session that they may feel uncomfortable about after they are no longer under the effects of the medicine. And in more extreme cases, this is an avenue for practitioners who are out of integrity to initiate abusive behavior that the journeyer may be more open to while inebriated. As the person seeking the guided work, ask any facilitator you are considering working with what kinds of touch they use during sessions. A guide should be able to tell you all of this up front and be able to understand the immense importance that navigating consent plays in reasonable use of touch during the session. If asked, a skilled guide should disclose the level of training and experience they have with using touch. If there's going to be significant touch work, you can ask to experience that in a sober state. And this part is huge. Please trust your intuition. If in a sober state something does not feel right, even if it is the slightest bit weird, even if this is the only guide you have a referral for, or the only price you can afford, or you have already invested in several prep sessions, please listen to that intuition. If you feel something is off, I am praying for you right now, for your ancestors to intervene and give you the strength to make an exit, and trust that you will find this healing somewhere else. You do not need to experience more harm in the process of healing. You are entering an extremely vulnerable state when you take a psychedelic. You need to be able to consent to that fully, and you need to be able to trust that your guide is, at bare minimum, not going to sexually abuse you. And again, this could be a revered guide with decades of experience. To be quite frank, I don't give a fuck what anyone else thinks. If you don't feel comfortable, don't work with them. There are many facilitators who do good work, and the effort to find one is absolutely worth it. Okay, so I want to give a trigger warning. I'm going to talk a bit more explicitly about a scenario that seems to be a pattern with guides who sexually abuse the journeyer. A common situation among survivors who were sexually abused by the practitioners they worked with is that the practitioner introduced the notion of healing sexual touch during the medicine session. In reports I have listened to, that can happen by saying it, as in the guide explains that they think they should touch the genitals of the person seeking healing or have sex with them as part of the healing, or they might indicate that it is some form of chakra healing. And then sometimes the guide simply starts doing this so-called healing sexual touch without explaining it. I have listened to reports where the guide touches the genitals of the person they are guiding with their hands, their mouth, and with their own genitals. This is always, 100% of the time, completely inappropriate. The person seeking healing may defer to the guide out of fear of the guide or out of fear of not healing without this sexual touch that the guide has suggested or non-consensually initiated. It can also be the case that the journeyer feels attracted to the guide or aroused from the psychedelic or entheogen and may not understand that engaging in sexual contact has a high potential to be harmful to themselves. While I do believe sexual touch can be healing, a few things. 1, if you want to experience healing sexual touch, please seek out a highly trained, trauma-informed sexological bodyworker. 2, that work would entail sessions explicitly naming the sexual touch as part of the treatment from the jump, and you would be exploring consent prior to any sexual touch occurring. And 3, while some people may want to add a psychedelic on top of sexual touch as a form of healing, and that might be very powerful, you would need to really convince me that the sexual touch needed to happen for the first time with a psychedelic. A much more responsible and cautious approach would be to build a strong foundation of sober touch before any touch work is combined with a psychedelic. And again, you would know prior to this happening that you had sought out a practitioner that specializes in healing sexual touch. So, if a guide tries to initiate sexual touch during any part of your experience with them, and they are 1, not a trained sexual touch provider, and 2, you did not seek them out for this type of healing, and 3, they did not explicitly discuss this with you in a sober state as part of their offerings, and 4, you have not done extensive work together around consent, then this is simply out of integrity. And even if the journeyer was feeling aroused or perhaps attracted to the practitioner, it is still not appropriate for the practitioner to introduce sexual touch. Another word about touch. It is okay and great to work with someone who uses no touch at all or supports you to do self-touch. There are many traditions where the only reason someone would touch you is to help you if you couldn't walk, and there is no use of therapeutic touch. I think for a lot of survivors, this is a very good choice. If you cannot say yes or no from an embodied place, if you often do what other people want or what you think they want, regardless of how you feel, if you sometimes don't know how you feel or what you want, these are all reasons to work with someone who doesn't use touch or is capable of guiding a session with no touch. Many guides will do things such as, if you need physical pressure, they have a weighted blanket or pillows for you. If you need a hug, they give you a soft pillow to hug, or they support you to hug yourself and feel into the comfort you can generate with your own body. And they comfort you with their presence and their voice, rather than physical contact. I will also add that even with the best of intentions, when practitioners have thoroughly discussed and explored consent and touch occurs in a form that you and they consented to, it can still be triggering and feel bad. That does not mean you shouldn't do touch work. It doesn't inherently mean you or the guide did something wrong. It might just mean you tried something and discovered it didn't feel right. And again, with a solid practitioner, you can hopefully explore that and process it and find new boundaries moving forward. While we are on the topic of touch exchange and guided work, I do want to name that sometimes the person doing the journeying non-consensually initiates touch with the guide. As the journeyer, you may be less inhibited or less aware, and this can lead to not being aware of appropriate touch or perhaps unconsciously acting out. It is important not to touch, grab, hug, or in any other way force physical contact on the guide without their consent. When this happens, it is the facilitator's responsibility to redirect your touch and make boundaries with you. If you attempt to kiss or engage in sexual contact, the guide should absolutely decline. If they take you up on the offer for sexual contact, despite the fact that you initiated this, that is a boundary violation and extremely concerning. Being non-consensually touched is potentially activating for everyone, regardless of their power role in the dynamic. If you are a guide and you have been non-consensually touched by the people you work with, I encourage you to find ways to talk about these boundaries before medicine sessions so that you already have a discussed framework for what kind of touch you are open to as well. This is especially important for guides who have had their bodies violated and may also identify as survivors. It can be hard to tell someone you are working with not to touch you or that they have crossed one of your boundaries, but again, This is a very important part of helping everyone involved have open, healing, and honest conversation about maintaining boundaries rather than enacting the violation again and again. Let's transition now to talking about dosage of the substance you will take for your journey. Guides will work at different doses, and some adhere to very different protocols. Talk with your guide about their thoughts on dosage. But here is the extra info I want you to have going into that conversation. It is okay to take a low dose. You do not need to blow your mind open on the first run. In that first medicine session, you are still in a very important trust-building process with the guide, the medicine, and yourself. As much as survivors sometimes want to be held in a container where someone else is able to attune to exactly what you need and you don't have to worry about safety, that is unfortunately not how it works. You have to actively build a safe container and be a full participant in that by advocating for yourself and by trusting yourself to walk with great care. I have very deep respect for high-dose work, and it is important to remember that high-dose work has a high risk. Few people want to talk about it because we are so focused on rebranding psychedelics for healing trauma and distancing the field from non-factual anti-drug narratives about entheogens and psychedelics. But you can traumatize or profoundly overwhelm yourself with too high of a dose. That is not to say that you should not do a high dose, but rather that you may want to consider what might be the minimum effective dose, and that you can always do a lower dose and then move up to a higher dose in consecutive sessions or titrate up in the same session. But what you cannot do is lower the dose once you have started your journey. This leads me to another aspect of this work, which is drug testing. When you see a guide to have an experience with an illegal substance, they acquire that substance illegally. So that means that you are trusting them to know their source and know the quality of their drugs. Where I live in the Bay Area in California, some cities have decriminalized certain plant medicines, which means that there is an upswing in mushroom-related products for sale. However, these products are not regulated by any governing body, which means that as consumers, we need to be savvy and protect ourselves. In February of 2024, SFGate reported on common contaminants and highly varying potency of many of the mushroom chocolates that are locally for sale in the Bay Area, noting that sometimes the chocolates contained completely different drugs than advertised. So yes, even a chocolate bar with nice packaging and branding that is super cute and boutique and loosely sold above ground can be advertising one thing and end up being a totally different substance or vastly different dose. This is your body, your health, and your healing. A guide should be able to tell you how they are ensuring that the drugs they give you are pure. They won't be giving you the name of their source, but they should be able to specify what kind of testing was done to know that what they provide you is truly what they intended, and they should have a solid relationship with whoever they buy from. There is some natural variation in the potency of drugs based on how they are synthesized. This is also true for plant-based medicines. Many factors go into how strong a substance is. Your guide should have a sense of the potency of the medicines they work with. Okay, let's talk now about intake sessions. Some facilitators will do an involved intake process, including prep sessions, and others will do less of that. Though it is not always the case, often people who work in a more psychological way will do more prep sessions, and folks working more spiritually will do less. Neither is better, they are simply different ways of working. You can do very powerful work with someone who is holding you spiritually and not that involved in knowing what your journeys are about or processing them with you. And some survivors may feel they need that specialized one-on-one care of knowing that their guide is really understanding and witnessing each step of their process. If you work with someone who doesn't engage that much in your preparation or integration process, that does not mean you won't do that work at all. Rather, it means that work will be done with someone else or in some other context. I'm not suggesting you don't need to prepare or integrate, simply that you may not be doing that with your guide, depending on how they work. Whatever type of guide you work with, at bare minimum, they should do some form of intake that assesses if you have any pre-existing health conditions that are contraindicated, including physical, mental, spiritual, and emotional ones. If the guide does not ask you questions about your health and medications, that is a huge red flag. Some substances pose little risk, but some of them can result in death if you have underlying health issues or mix them with certain medications. You can and should also do your own research online by seeking out information about health risks and medication combinations with whatever entheogen or psychedelic you are considering consuming. There is a theme here in what I am suggesting, which is that you vet the people you work with, but also you educate yourself so that you can be collaborating on making a safer, lower risk environment for your healing. The last thing I want to lightly touch on is trip sitting. Trip sitting, as it is commonly called, is when someone who is typically not highly trained offers you basic care around your journey to keep you safe. I talk about trip sitting and peer support at length in a later episode on solo journeys, so if you choose this route, please listen to that episode. But a brief description: trip sitters are not guiding your journey, they are not interjecting or interpreting, they are doing things like getting you water and managing the temperature in the room. Sometimes trip sitting involves more in-depth care, but at some point, I would refer to that as facilitation. Trip sitting is usually done among community members, and there is no money exchanged for it. This is a very DIY way of working. It can make the work very accessible because it is free and typically done with someone you know. Trip sitting is a great resource, though it can pose some risks. One of the major considerations is simply, is this level of holding enough for the work you want to do? But again, I go into this in depth in the Solo Journeys episode, so I'm going to leave it there for now. In conclusion, what I want to inspire you toward in this episode is an interest in protecting yourself and seeking out a very good fit should you embark on this work. And this is a very complex and nuanced conversation for survivors, because sometimes bad things happen even when you take steps to prevent that. And it can feel at times like the focus on survivors protecting themselves is a way of blaming them for the violence they experience. I want to make it very clear that if any guide crosses a line with you in the future or has crossed a line with you in the past, that is never your fault. As a practitioner, I can say, I am responsible for my own choices and actions. Encouraging you to protect yourself in this instance is not a coded way to blame you if something bad happens in the future or make it your responsibility to end sexual violence through protective measures. As psychedelics go mainstream, there are going to be more incidences of abuse from guides emerging. And unfortunately, the research already shows a large number of those incidences are going to be with people who are survivors of sexual violence. Healing with psychedelics and entheogens can be incredibly effective with the right conditions. We need to protect each other. This entire series is available with no paywall as a part of my contribution to preventing harm from happening. If you know someone who could benefit from listening, don't hesitate. Let's get people this information as soon as they start thinking about working with psychedelics, either as the facilitator or as the journeyer. Okay, we will leave it there for today. Please take care of yourself after listening to this episode and as you move through the entire series, and I really mean that. Also, I'm thinking I will likely do some free online Q&A sessions for people who have questions related to the series. I will announce the dates for that on my email list. If you want to support the show, please rate it on whatever podcasting app you use and consider sharing this episode with people who may benefit. Thank you so much for supporting this work. I teach occasional classes, offer group and individual consultation to clinicians around the world, and provide psychotherapy to people located in California. If you're curious about my offerings, you can find more information and contact me via my website, Northrup.com. And here's where I give out my social media handles, but I want to say a little something about social media. You only see what ends up being popular enough to come into your feed the days that you look at the app, an app that is controlled and censored by capitalist elites. If you want to ensure you hear about ways to work with me, learn from me, or get healing support, join my email list. I send very few emails, usually less than 5 a year. You can find it on my website, lauramainorthrup.com, or there's a link in the show notes. And again, that is also where I will announce dates for any online Q&A sessions related to this season. So def sign up if you want to hear about those. And if you want to see memes and leave things up to social media fate, find me on Instagram at LauraMayNorthrup. And don't forget, I have a new book out, Radical Healership. Check it out. Link in the show notes. Okay, until next time.